John Dewey was a fascinating pioneer of American education, and while in grad school, many students read his seminal works of Democracy and Education or Education and Experience. It's rare to have taken just the strand of ethics or social justice, which he intertwines in so many of his works, and look at those exclusively. But John Dewey, to understand his ideas and his philosophies, it's important to understand his background and his life, how he was able to become such a prominent philosopher and an author. He was born right before the Civil War breaks out in 1861, so 2 years prior to that, and he's born in Vermont. He's a product of the public schools, and he's in them until the age of 15 when he actually starts university at the University of Vermont. Now, when the Civil War breaks out, his father decides he's going to be a volunteer for the Union Army. He goes and he conscripts, and then when he comes back, he's able to get enough money to purchase a tobacco shop, which in this day and age puts the Dewey family quite well off. So they have financial stability. Now, after John Dewey graduates from university, his cousin, who's a principal at a seminary college, gets him a teaching gig. And he does that for about 2 years before he gets laid off. And to him, it seems like it's no big deal that there's just this transition in life, and he decides to pursue his doctorate degree anyway. He goes to Johns Hopkins University, which, as the stars align, he's able to study under the great philosopher and psychologist G. Stanley Hall and a couple other prominent philosophers at the time. So this, along with his teachers in university, which he continues to discuss philosophy with his entire life, it helps him kind of come to terms with this dialectical thinking of these different factors of the world. And this is a lot of the thought that we're going to see intertwined in his own personal philosophy on education. Throughout his life, he teaches at several prestigious universities. He goes to the University of Michigan, then he switches to the University of Minnesota. A year later, he comes back to the University of Michigan again. He moves to New York, where he lives the rest of his life until 1952 when he passes away. He teaches at Columbia College, Columbia University, Teachers College there. And through this time and this process, he published over 1,000 works. So there's just tons and tons of information out there from John Dewey's thoughts. And so when he wasn't spending time growing this beautiful mustache that he has, even at this young age, he's forming his ideas of educational philosophy reform, and he's really focusing on the ideas that humans have habits and change happens, and what makes a habit and how we deal with change is kind of reflecting on this process as the change is happening to try to determine and understand what is happening, why is this happening, how do I change as a product of this. And a lot of this requires the creativity that we're going to see in his progressive education, which he preaches. So here we see him, older age, still a fantastic mustache, hunched over what I assume is one of his 1,000 works that he's piecing together. And what Dewey says is the role of schools is that they should be the driving force and the training centers for democracies. So in his famous work, Democracy and Education, we see this idea that in order for societies to evolve, progress, and move forward, we need to get away from these entrenched ideas that the past ideas that have driven schools from the industrial ages of kids need to know this and memorize this and this rote process. He says that's not going to be able to drive future change, innovation, progress, and growth in our democracy. Students instead need to be able to learn to express their thoughts, feelings, and reflections on things. And it's not just about this drill and kill of rote memorization, but there's something more going on at the heart, which we see manifest itself beautifully in Dewey saying that schools need to balance science and art. That yes, we have data and analysis in the sciences, but there's something else that's unexplained. The beauty of a painting, when we hear a symphony, how do we feel about that? How do we explain that? Some of that just isn't quantifiable, and schools also need to be able to pursue and get their students to understand those issues as well. Now, on knowledge, he says this, that knowledge, as we traditionally think of it, is not true. Knowledge is actually an active process. And he says that knowledge is a verb because it's a transformative force. It's something that we do, and it changes us as people as we go through the process of acquiring knowledge and using our knowledge. It will change the very core of who we are in the life that we live. Every experience will be different after knowledge. So it's not something that is locked away in your brain that say like, I am knowledgeable because I know the capital of all the 50 states. No. Dewey says you could look at it now to kind of conceptualize what Bloom's taxonomy is. Knowledge is not just the lower level. Knowledge is all of those levels of Bloom's taxonomy. Knowledge is your analysis. Knowledge is your ability to evaluate. Knowledge is your ability to create, because that's when we observe knowledge in action. That's when we actually see it. And all of this action, it requires contemplation along with it to make it worth anything at all. Just doing something blindly, following orders, not knowing why, that's not true knowledge. Dewey says that knowledge comes from this process of understanding, of doing, reflecting, thus changing. So you might have a bad experience, but that is going to help you reflect and have a better experience in the future. Now, teachers' roles amongst all of this is to set up activities where the students can actually do this, where they get this little bit of information and they could expand into this role of knowledge by being able to revise, apply, and expand what they know. Now, teachers, they're not going to just dish information, because you have to kind of address the holistic child, but teachers have to be masters of their subject area, and not just that, but things that are tangential to the subject area. So if you teach English, that's great that you know how to write an essay, but you also, besides parts of speech, verbs, nouns, adjectives, adverbs, all that stuff, pronoun antecedent agreement, you need to understand the process to be able to guide students through critical thinking, because thinking like someone who writes an essay is just as important as knowing the parts of speech, that analytical thinking process. So Dewey says without this, we are doing students a disservice, and ethical schools will have teachers that follow this track, and ethical schools that rely on the principles of social justice will apply these principles of knowledge to all learners. Now, in doing this, it's important to pursue the ethical conduct that requires we just have one identity. And with that, there's one set of ethical principles that should rule all conduct. You shouldn't have a separate school self and home self, but you should have the comfort and understanding of your life and the world to have one self. So sometimes I know teachers get flack for having multiple identities. You can't possibly be this nice person all the time outside of school, or outside of school someone might say, well, I hope you don't bring that attitude inside of school. Dewey preaches that ethical principles should just be this common stamp. There's ethics, there's non-ethics, and there's not much sway area between different personalities that you might adopt, because his ideology is that there is just this one identity. It's not split into separate parts based on your so-called occupation, which we'll get into later, occupations. But when we look at groups, because obviously individual one-to-one teaching doesn't happen so much anymore, that groups are larger than individuals. Now, in obvious and literal sense, we can see that 2 is greater than 1, 3 is greater than 1. Yes, a group is larger, but it's larger in a different sense in that they bear consideration in the decision-making process. Is this good for the group? If I am a teacher and I want to conduct myself ethically, I must look at a decision that affects the whole institution. If I decide I'm going to take a personal day off, how does that affect everyone else? My students, are we able to get a sub? There's a lot of considerations to go on there. And when we are looking at children, it's important to address the whole child. You cannot just address a child piecemeal. So we said previously, looking at an English teacher, you can't just say, oh, today we're going to talk about the parts of speech, and you're going to understand what a noun is. That's just one small compartment of a whole child. You have to appeal to all different parts of them. And in doing this, we're trying to, of course, push the bar further, improve society, get progress for democracy, and we want to make sure that children are educated not just to obey, but we want to make sure that they're versatile and that they're self-directing. This is the goal of education, because the democracy is going to have to push forward and self-direct. Because of this, because we look at the group aspects, that we have to consider others that are larger than maybe our own personal needs, it's important to examine the issue of social life. Because social life is ever-changing, ebbing and flowing, education has to serve society through frequent inquiry. It has to prepare children to get used to social life. So if we are teaching kids to get ready for interaction in a social world, but we don't give them that social aspect, that social learning, we're doing a disservice because there's a disconnect. Dewey would argue that that is not ethical. Now, in understanding that the school needs to model social life and we need to have social utility in what we do, Dewey says in teaching, we need to focus on things that are applicable. Only teach what has value for life. So in the modern times, I've seen a lot of posts on social media where people are talking about or even complaining, why do we teach people to balance checkbooks anymore when no one does it? Why do we teach kids to learn cursive when no one writes in cursive anymore? Although history teachers, myself included, might argue that that's to understand historical documents that otherwise would be in a different language and lose their value if not for the ability to read cursive. But regardless, there are many people who are arguing against teaching things like algebra, and they're saying let's focus on applicable math, like how to do your taxes, because these are conundrums that people actually experience and they might be able to solve for X, but they don't know how to fill in a tax form. This closely models the modern day biopsychosocial model, Dewey believing that you need to look at social life as well. Now, biological isn't really so much in Dewey's scope and sequence just yet, but he understands if we're looking at students and we're looking at groups, there's a lot of overlap here. And to understand what's best for the student, aka to find their pinpoint center of well-being, there's a lot of different factors that have to be addressed, and the ethical schools will do that for all learners. And he says this really comes down to a moral trinity, that there's three factors. A school will be deemed ethical if it mirrors the social constructs happening in society at large. So we model our schools off of this social life. And that students are active in creating. This knowledge that's an active process to build, to apply, to evaluate, to use what you know in a traditional sense, and that the curriculum is going to help students understand their larger role in the world. What aspects do they understand and can they play in being one person amongst over 7 billion people in the world population? So as an ethical product, this final result, students hopefully have these constructs that poor decisions come from a lack of thinking. While Dewey gets a lot of criticism for this point, this is his belief that it's kind of romantic, humanistic, Maslow-like, that if something goes wrong, maybe it's because you didn't focus enough, which kind of negates the idea that some people just have bad motives. But Dewey does believe that a person needs to have the courage to stand for something in life. So find what you believe in and kind of plant roots like a tree and stick to it. And that your good judgment is going to come through actual practice. But this practice requires guidance. So hence the role of a teacher. This ethical product comes from a teacher offering you these activities, this give and take that Dewey had when he was in the University of Vermont, to be able to talk with his teacher about philosophical essays throughout all his life. So if you don't have this right, proper guidance that an ethical school provides, students are going to be underfunctioning or malfunctioning as adults, and they might not have this thinking that will lead to constant poor decision after poor decision. So when we look in a school, obviously we're focused on a lot of testing nowadays, but a proponent of Dewey's theories in an ethical product would understand that as an end result, we have this thought that testing is secondary to learning. Instead of learning to achieve, we should learn to learn. And these are the ideas that root themselves in a lot of his progressive ideologies, that knowing is not as important, knowing in the traditional sense, prior to it being categorized as a verb by Dewey. Knowing is not as important as being able to apply, especially in the age of Google, when I could just pull out my phone, look anything up on this, and say like, okay, great, now I know the capitals of all 50 states. Well, I could do that in milliseconds, so maybe I could outsource that from my brain to this device that connects to the internet. But what does that mean? Why is it important? Why should it matter? That's the application. Now, within that, Dewey says it's important to understand there's not knowledge and value separate from each other, but they are constantly intertwined. So this idea of integrity and what to do with this application of knowledge, it cannot separate. And when we look in occupation, whether student occupation or adult occupation, they need to be understood in the term that they are just activities. Any activity where a person can draw on their intelligence through action and interaction with others is an occupation. So conversation could be an occupation. When we look at occupations, we need to make sure that they are conducted to high morals. Now, this matters because within different occupations, there's tons of different situations. Each occupation is, in fact, its own situation. And Dewey believes that morals are situational and not set. So it's very hard to teach just a code of morals. What you have to do is teach kind of moral framework in the hopes that once you have this framework, this base, students will be able, because they're constantly applying knowledge and creating, is they will be able to apply this framework to all different situations, because you cannot just say cut and dry, black and white, this is right, this is wrong. Things are constantly changing. So the questions for teachers to understand, for them to consider as they're trying to make ethical strivings towards this Dewey vision of progressive education, is how does the material actually connect to your students? What are you going to do to bring it alive and make it applicable for their world? What does it do to make them actually grow and develop? How can they engage with this new material and continue to expand their learning? And of course, is the material relevant? You might be teaching the best lesson, the most awesome principles of algebra, but do the students know how they can apply this material to society at large? Does this actually model the social life that happens outside the brick and mortar walls that you are teaching within, or perhaps online walls, but how can the students actually use it? Now, that doesn't mean you have to spoon feed that answer to kids and say, kids, here's why this is important, but as guidance from a teacher that Dewey advocates for, you should be able to guide them along to find that understanding of why it's important. So in this process, there's a lot of student and teacher talk, but democracy means everyone. If we're looking at ethical schools and we're looking at democracy in education, which one of the most famous works that Dewey writes, is that we need to look at all stakeholders, and they need to have a say in deliberation, in how we learn, how we allocate funds, the decisions that we make. Ethical schools will engage all parties, the community at large, parents, teachers, students, anyone that's involved in the process. You might be a taxpayer living in town, but you have no kids. You should still be part of this process. Now, if all else fails, let's rewind thousands of years. Dewey says, you could look at Aristotle's good man test. Yeah, Greeks, they were smart too, and thought a lot about ethics. So Aristotle had this idea that if you can't figure out what to do in a certain situation, what you should actually do is think about what the best person you know would do in that situation. Now, it doesn't really help us decide right or wrong because there's so many nuances and intricacies in each changing and evolving situation. But what it does do is help us in deliberation. It helps us put concrete ideas into our mind to decide in a better format. So Aristotle picks the best person that he knows. I maybe pick a fictional character. I had a professional development many years ago where someone told us to think of, she actually thought of James Bond. When it was a situation that got her heated, when kids were screaming in her classroom, she just thought of like cool, collected James Bond pulling on the cufflinks. So in situations that maybe try my decision-making process or my judgment, I think, what would Atticus Finch do? Which by the movie is forever ingrained in my mind as Gregory Peck, standing fair, just, and ready to make progress in society, doing the right thing, being a great father. So in any situation where I don't know what to do, I try to think like Atticus Finch. Although fictional, probably the best person that I know, what would he do? And that's Dewey.